Right, so I think now we're going to move quickly on. So I'd say save any questions. We've got another quarter of an hour talk by David on butterfly indicators, and then we'll have some questions. So save them up, put them in the chat, or you can raise a hand and we'll come to you afterwards. So David, over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks, Christina. It's amazing how far we've come, and a lot of that's down to Christina's enthusiasm and energy. Yeah, I'm going to cover the indicators side of how we then use the data, and thanks particularly to Chris, Francois, and Martin, who I've borrowed some of their slides from, so they'll probably recognise some things I'm showing. But before I talk about what indicators we've produced, I think it's worth remembering that we should be sort of celebrating the fact that butterflies are fantastic indicators in the way that they can complement other biodiversity and environmental indicators because of their life cycles, what they tell us about the environment, that they're pretty diverse and also quite specific in terms of subtle changes in habitats that are not well picked up by other methods, and relatively easy to observe, certainly for insects, and they are popular both for people contributing to their monitoring, but also a deep love of butterflies, which perhaps isn't shared by all insect groups. So yeah, we've got a lot of positives to build on as a group to work on. And of course, we've heard already that we've got a fantastic, and I would say world-leading data resource in terms of monitoring. This is the figure from the latest indicator report that we produced for the European indicator set for the European Environment Agency. So this where we brought together the EU monitoring schemes, but also taking a wider view on what's happening to butterflies in Europe. So yeah, thanks to everybody who's helps coordinate that effort on the grounds. This represents a huge, immense effort by people across the whole of Europe. And as we've heard from Christina, that this is growing rapidly. So this is the figure that we also put in the indicator report, which shows the number of transects walked and the number of schemes being developed across Europe. And what it's showing is a strong growth in coverage of butterfly monitoring schemes across Europe. And this is fantastic, it improves our coverage of Europe, but also provides challenges in terms of we need to analyze this data sensibly to deal with the gaps. So we've got gaps in the early years when there were relatively few schemes. And even in the later years, we know that there are parts of countries covered well and parts of countries not covered well. And also we've got gaps within the season where not all weeks can be recorded because of weather conditions or not, people not being available to do the monitoring. Fortunately, we've got quite a well-developed analysis approach, which is sort of brought together under the eBMS package. And I think there's going to be some talks later on in the week about how to use that package. But we have ways of dealing with this, with these gaps. And what that allows us to do is to bring together the data across schemes and across Europe. So this is illustrated by these plots that I'm sure you're quite familiar with, where we produce an index of abundance, a sort of relative measure of how abundant a species is through time. So this plot goes back to the 90s up to recent period, and we can also do this for different parts of Europe, particularly different monitoring schemes across Europe. So this plot also shows the different colours of the different schemes that maybe start at different periods and broadly show the similar sort of population fluctuations and trends, but there's differences, clearly differences between years, but also differences between different parts of Europe. So in wanting to produce an overall measure of Europe, we need to bring together this data into a single summary message. So that's the sort of next step of the indicator process, is that there's some statistical models that take into account different schemes across Europe and also the different years that schemes are operating to come up with an overall measure of a European scale from the available data, the relative index of abundance through time for this species, and as we know, for the wool brown, as Martimagera, is shown a decline in many parts of Europe, most parts of Europe, and this is reflected in the overall measure across Europe. And we can produce the measure of the indicator, the relative abundance. We can also have a measure of how uncertain we are in our estimate of the relative abundance. So the grey bars show our uncertainty around this average figure. So that's so the wool brown is a sort of well-known example, but also but there is variability between species. There are other species showing declines, but also less clear-cut trends for other species. So I'll show a few examples and choose Agliatica really to illustrate that what we think of certainly in Northern Europe as a relatively common and widespread species is also showing a marked decline at the European level. So this isn't just about rare species declining. We are seeing, in terms of distribution extent, relatively widespread species also declining. And also some species we know which can be important for particular habitats. Euphrosyne being an example here. I guess we've seen declines in distribution, but there may be some evidence that some of these declines are leveling off in some situations. So this is an example where there was a clear decline and some leveling off. So this may reflect either that it's now restricted to very few places, but it may be that conservation effort protection may be having a positive effect or sort of helping to deal with the problems. We also know that not all species are declining. We're seeing big range changes for some species, Agenus paphia being an example where it's increasing its distribution. And this is also being reflected in the abundance coming from the standardized monitoring data. And similarly, Egeria also generally is increasing across much of Europe. But then we have clear-cut trends. We also have some sort of mixed trends. So species such as this, where there was a decline and some evidence of recovery, again, maybe increasing in its range, perhaps benefiting from climate warming in parts of Europe. And Balagus, another example where in this case, we've seen an increase and then some evidence that that is being reversed and a decline in more recent period. So this, this adds complexity for us in terms of trying to boil all this variability between species, between parts of Europe into a single number of how butterflies are doing. But policymakers and the public do need these simplified measures which allow us to communicate quite a complex picture in a single plot or a single number. So our best example of this is the European grassland indicator, which has been produced since 2005, I think, whereby a group of experts across Europe identified a set of 17 species which were associated with grassland habitats, trying to include some relatively widespread and common species, but also some rarer species to provide a mix of a basket of species to try and reflect the overall status of grasslands. And this is our sort of top level, high level indicator that's now got quite a high profile within Europe as part of one of its sustainable development goal indicators, and also being potentially a measure under the nature restoration law. But what it's showing, unfortunately, is a declining picture across both EU 27 countries, showing a 32% decline in the latest update, and more larger decline of 36% when we bring in all the European schemes. And you'll see from the plots that we've got a more a sort of tighter measure for the whole of Europe because we bring in much more data, so we're more certain about that trend of decline. And I've mentioned the variability in species. So this is another way of looking at it for the grassland indicator species, which itself also includes species which are increasing. So Actium being an example at the top. So it's increasing, although even in this case, it's quite a large change, but we're relatively uncertain about this because of variability within the data. Where we're perhaps more certain is some of the declining species. So the most extreme is Phangarus arion, which has shown a large, strong decline, and we're pretty certain about that, which is perhaps no surprise to those on the call. And the reasons are well known. This is one of Chris's photos. We know what good looks like in terms of grassland: flower rich, diverse, good structure, etc. We also know what bad looks like, where highly intensive, effectively monoculture grasslands predominate in certain parts of Europe. So the grassland indicator is being driven by these two ways of managing grasslands. And the third factor we know is abandonment of traditionally managed grassland habitats in parts of Europe, which are undergoing succession, which are affecting the grassland butterfly species. So we know the causes, and we think this is driving this overall picture of grassland, and clearly need different solutions in different contexts. So just my final couple of slides really is, so I think we've been hugely successful as a community at raising the profile and producing an indicator that's used at a high political level. But I think we should always reflect on how good are these indicators, and accept that we do have still have a very incomplete picture at the European level. So we know we have gaps, certainly when we think about the whole continent. We have some corrections for that within our analysis approaches, but we know that we'd have a much more reliable measure if we had we could cover some of these gaps, particularly in the east and south of Europe. And so that's really fantastic that the developments we're making under the Able and Spring project are putting us in a much stronger position to report on butterflies going forward. It's also important to note that we also have gaps in terms of species that we're able to report on. I think we report on around about a third. We can produce trends for about a third of the species in butterflies in Europe. So we know we're not reporting on many rare and threatened species. So this may give us an overly optimistic picture of trends, even though we're seeing declines. It may be much worse if we were better able to cover rare and threatened species. And also, given the indicators only started in the 90s, there is a risk and a potential of shifting baselines, that we sort of forget what we've lost. And this is illustrated very well by the work in the Netherlands, where Chris and colleagues have taken a much longer view using the opportunistic recording data, and has shown very stark declines in the early 1900s onwards, and much of the loss, around 65% under this analysis, was before the 1980s. So if we look at this figure in terms of 1990 onwards, where the grassland indicator for Europe is being reported, in the Netherlands at least, it's a relatively stable period. So we may be missing a lot of these big changes that have happened. And yeah, the eBMS is really only this recent period. But so we know there are problems with the indicators, but we should celebrate its successes as well. And I think it is highly significant. It's the only indicator for insects, and so therefore is very complementary to bird indicators, but it's providing us a very different and valuable information on how the environment's changing. And butterflies are particularly sensitive to fine scale, short-term changes in vegetation and management of sites and climate change. But we are seeing big changes already. We know that there's some potentially big threats in terms of climate extremes, but also some potentially positive focus on restoration, which may reverse some of these declines. So monitoring is vital to allow us to understand these how these butterflies are going to change in the future. So yeah, so thank you again. And I think we should thank the EU for putting money into the Able and Spring projects as well. That's allow us to move on very rapidly in the last 5 years or so. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. That's a lovely summary of where we've got to in terms of using all this data to show what's going on out there, because it is a unique data set, and we know a lot of people in Europe are looking to it to see what's going on, to try and understand what's going on. And as David said, there are very few other indicators out there that can give us this fine scale look at what's going on.